In May of 1787, delegates from 12 of the colonies descended on Philadelphia to correct the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island refused to attend. Within 5 days, the delegates abandoned this idea of fixing the Articles and instead decided to create an entirely new government. But what would this government look like? Obviously, it could not be a monarchy or a constitutional monarchy, for kings could not be trusted. It could be a form of what's called a pure democracy in which every eligible person gets one vote. But there were now 4 million people in the United States, plus another 500,000 slaves, and it was unclear that a pure democracy would actually work. All the democracies of olden times had been much smaller populations. Instead, perhaps a republic would be best. There was a good republic in Holland, for example, and the idea was that a government in which representatives voted on behalf of their constituents, that would allow a rather large country to still be able to get things done. But a republic included certain problems. How were you going to determine how many representatives each state received? The small states wanted an equal vote so that the large states would not overpower them. But the large states wanted more votes based on population. After all, the laws impacted their citizens more because they had more citizens. There was also the issue of slavery. The southern states wanted to include slaves as part of the population, which would give them more power. The northern states, meanwhile, had been considering abolition for the past several years and did not think slaves should count in population at all. The result was a series of compromises. Congress, the legislative body of the United States, would be divided into two houses. An upper house, called the Senate, would be populated equally. Each state would receive 2 senators, 2 votes, regardless of population. The lower house, called the House of Representatives, would be determined by population. Each state would receive a number of votes based on its population. That still left the issue of slavery. The delegates finally compromised and decided that slaves would count as 3/5 in terms of population. So for every 5 slaves, 3 of them counted towards population, 60%. That satisfied both the North and the South, and the Constitution was able to figure out exactly how many representatives would be in Congress. The delegates also agreed in a division of power. Now recall that the American Revolution had started in part because of a fear of a certain body having too much power, either the king having too much power or Parliament having too much power. So dividing the power would help. They decided that the legislative body, Congress, would make the laws. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives would have to agree. They also decided that an executive branch made up of the president and the vice president would execute and enforce any laws, and therefore the president needed to also be commander-in-chief of the army. And finally, a judiciary branch, the Supreme Court, would interpret the laws and decide how those laws were to be followed. 3 separate branches so that no single branch would have too much power. They also decided to make it so that each branch was able to control just certain aspects of the others. This would allow them to keep other branches in check, make sure no branch received too much power, and would also keep them involved with one another. So, for example, the president had the power to veto a law that Congress made. That gave the president power over Congress. The president also appointed judges to the Supreme Court, and therefore the president had some power over the Supreme Court as well. Congress was able to make laws, and if they made a law that the president vetoed, they could, if they united, block the veto and overrule it. Therefore, they had power over the president. Congress could also impeach the president, giving them even further power. Congress also had to approve the selection of judges in the Supreme Court. That let them have a little bit of power over the Supreme Court as well. And the Supreme Court also had power over the other 2 branches. First off, it was allowed to interpret all laws, and if any of them were unconstitutional, it could strike them down. Further, if there was an executive order made by the president that was unconstitutional, it could strike that down as well. But another aspect of the Supreme Court allowed it to endure beyond Congress and the presidency. Supreme Court judges were nominated for life, and whereas congressmen came and go, president came and go, the Supreme Court abided. And so that gave them a certain amount of power over the other two branches. My main point in considering the Constitution was that, first off, we saw that the Articles of Confederation were only good for a very specific purpose, the fighting of that war. And as soon as the war was over, the American Republic needed something else that would help it grow. The Constitution would be that new government. But when they made the Constitution, the Founding Fathers made it in the context of the American Revolution. They had the American Revolution on their mind, and they were worried about one branch having too much power, and they were worried about the federal government becoming too powerful overall or too weak to be effective. And so they found a balanced Constitution. On the 8th of September, 1787, the Constitution was done, but it was still not legal. It would have to be ratified by some 9 of the 13 states before it became binding.